In our previous entries, we introduced the idea that the Gospel of John is a multi-front polemic, that it is composed to deal with problems posed by a variety of opponents, including Jews, the Baptist sect, and Gnostics. We also considered the history of John's scholarship relative to the anti-Gnostic hypothesis. But before we enter into an in-depth analysis of John's relationship with Christian or Hermetic Gnosticism, it will behoove us to first deal with several potential objections to my proposal. Some of the potential objections are as follows. 1. Trinitarian objections on the basis of an ambiguous or balanced Johannine Christology. 2. Objections on the basis of a presumed lack of polemical clarity. 3. Objections on the basis of a perceived lack of interest in historical polemic in the other Gospels. 4. Objections on the basis of later Gnostic infatuation with the Gospel of John. 5. Objections on the basis of a presumed lack of doctrinal clarity in the first century. 6. Trinitarian objections on the basis of alleged inefficiency of potential anti-Gnostic statements. And 7. Objections based on the satisfaction provided by Jewish evidence. So let's consider the first potential objection. 1. An ambiguous or balanced Johannine Christology. First, Trinitarian John scholar Stephen S. Smalley, in his book John, Evangelist and Interpreter, 1978, provides an intriguing conclusion about John's Christological outlook. Quote, "The Johannine Christ, we may conclude, was neither God alone nor man alone. The Christology of the fourth Gospel is perfectly balanced between the two poles, which are now labeled Docetic and Adoptionist." End quote. This reading draws what Trinitarians have called a paradoxical shape for John's Christology. But, as Smalley demonstrates, by describing the Gospel of John as simultaneously Docetic and Adoptionist, the Trinitarian reading is really presenting a contradiction, a Jesus who oscillates between being fully God and not God. We are not to ever choose one side of the contradiction or the other. This would be to neglect clear and important data. Rather, we are to balance, as Smalley says, between the two. Let us consider the evidence for such a radical and challenging proposal. Smalley writes, quote, "At one moment, Jesus can be reported by St. John as saying, 'I and the Father are one,' and at another, 'The Father is greater than I.' Again, Jesus in this gospel is both one with God and distinct from him. He is from the Father, but he has also come into the world. So far as the relation between Jesus and God, or Jesus and man, is concerned, John's Christology swings quite happily between the extremes of what were later defined as Docetism and Adoptionism." End quote. Other reasonable interpretations of this language notwithstanding, the Trinitarian interpretation of the data leads Smalley to identify on one side a docetic Jesus, that is, a Jesus who is completely God, and on the other side, a Jesus who is truly human and subordinate to God. Of course, isolating the docetic side of Smalley's interpretation would immediately yield a Gnostic Christology, while isolating the other would yield a biblical Unitarian interpretation. Trinitarians reel, of course, at the thought of falling too deeply into either side, and hope to balance on a fulcrum. Biblical Unitarians, on the other hand, happily agree with Trinitarians on their second conclusion, that John presents a human Jesus distinct from God. Their issue is with the side which Trinitarians share with the Gnostics, that John's Jesus was fully God. From the Unitarian perspective, the Trinitarians have processed half of the data correctly, and the Unitarian quest becomes one to convince the Trinitarians that both they and the Gnostics are misunderstanding or abusing the other half of the data. The Trinitarian may prove to have the more difficult situation here. His is a battle on two fronts, against both Gnosticism and Unitarianism, which both offer evidence he wholeheartedly agrees with. In other words, the Trinitarian's game becomes one of stamina, of keeping up a balancing act between two undesirable options as long as possible. Because Trinitarianism agrees in part with the Gnostic interpretation of Jesus, this evidently prevents many Trinitarian scholars, like Smalley, from recognizing that the Gospel of John contains anti-Gnostic polemic. As Smalley concludes, if the Gospel of John really were concerned with refuting Gnostic visions of Jesus, then, quote, presumably the evangelist would not have been so unguarded in his theological statements that these could have been used, as they were used, by Orthodox and heretic alike in due course in support of their respective positions. It becomes difficult, if not impossible, to sustain the opinion that the purpose of the fourth gospel was polemic against Gnostic heresy. End quote. This is, as Smalley admits, a presumptuous conclusion, but it is also a problematic one. First, it assumes that John would have considered the Gnostic Jesus and the Orthodox Trinitarian Jesus very different. But depending on which Gnostic Christology one consults, the two Christs have proven to have fewer differences than has commonly been suggested. Second, it comes close to presuming to know the best way to deal with the circumstances John was facing. But because those exact circumstances are cloudy and still a matter of regular debate, it is difficult to make such a judgment. A polemical approach which may have served one set of persons in a certain time and place may not seem as useful in another. But our concern should be only for determining what the intentions of the fourth gospel were, not whether or not it utilized the most effective methods possible. Third, Smalley's conclusion unfairly assumes that if John is concerned with heresy, then John's theological statements are unguarded. Smalley ignores the possibility that John not only was careful in his argumentation, but also that the Trinitarians have fallen into the same misunderstanding and tendency towards exploitation as John's opponents. Again, it will be important to keep the Gospel's prominent misunderstanding motif in view. In this light, we discover that most of the passages which both the Gnostics and Trinitarians cite for support are not only connected to this motif, but are often taken directly from the mouths of Jesus' ignorant and abusive opponents. It is thus easy to imagine that the Trinitarians and the Gnostics have themselves either misunderstood or abused John. Here, analyzing the relationship between John and Gnosis in light of the biblical Unitarian Christology begins to show its value. Only the biblical Unitarian interpretation, which finds no common ground with Gnostic exegesis, is able to put enough distance between the Gospel of John and Gnosticism to discern John's anti-Gnostic polemic. Ultimately, Smalley holds that maintaining an anti-Gnostic view of the Gospel is difficult if not impossible, because John sounds Gnostic in some passages. But in this we may reveal another strength of my proposal, which not only distances John from true dependence on Gnosis, but also accounts for why he frequently sounds Gnostic. The Gospel of John is both refuting and competing with Gnosticism by presenting Jewish Christian versions of Gnostic trends. If this is true, then both the Gnostics and the Trinitarians reading John as truly tending towards some degree of Docetism is spoiled. In the end, the only thing which becomes difficult if not impossible is discerning an anti-Gnostic polemic in John from the standpoint of Trinitarianism. 2. A presumed lack of polemical clarity. We will now confront the second possible objection, which is closely related to the first, that of the Gospel's alleged lack of clear anti-Gnostic argument. It has already been well established that John wrote during the rise of Gnosticism in the late 1st century. It is also widely accepted that John's epistles are concerned with some sort of Gnostic refutation, and their direct argumentation about Christology make this conclusion easy. We are safe in saying, with the majority of scholars, that 1 John has in mind to attack either a Docetic or a separationist vision of the Savior, or both. However, some might cite the Gospel of John's lack of the same explicit polemic as reason to doubt that Gnosticism is also the Gospel's concern. But such analysis is short-sighted. The Gospel of John and 1 John represent two genres of literature which are working independently towards a mutual purpose. 1 John is a church epistle, drawn up to combat a direct and immediate threat to the community. The real and present danger of gnosis demands the lucid and immediate polemic which 1 John so urgently offers. On the other hand, the Gospel of John is a gospel. Its biographical nature will not allow for the controversies of the late 1st century to be as present and explicit as they are in 1 John. Thus, the Gospel of John's approach, out of necessity, becomes that of a restrained narratival polemic. The life and ministry of the historical Jesus provide an indirect assault on John's doctrinal foes. John's ingenious decision to patiently allow Jesus himself to correct the record through the misunderstanding motif is effective and perhaps more strategic than the frustration and urgency bleeding through the evangelist's letters, which in my view were written at least after the Gospel's first edition. 3. A presumed lack of early Jewish Christian interest in polemical history. Similar to the above objection, some might point to the Synoptic Gospel's evident lack of anti-Gnostic polemic, or lack of answers to other community controversies, as reasons to doubt that the fourth Gospel aims to address theological conflict in John's community. Craig Keener and others have suggested that, quote, early Christians did not indulge the temptation to create answers for their own situations in the Jesus tradition preserved in the Synoptics. Several of the major problems that the early church encountered, such as conflict over circumcision, never show up in the gospel materials. End quote. But how valuable is such analysis to our present inquiry into John? It should go without saying that the synoptic writer's habits and intentions should not cage the writer of the fourth gospel. Today, endless scholars incessantly point out the many differences between the Gospel of John and the synoptics in terms of style, content, grammar, and even theology. And Keener himself writes, quote, that John's biography of Jesus differs from those of the synoptics is evident. What accounts for these differences? End quote. One way to account for some of these differences, at least some of the differences related to the content and presentation of the discourse material, is that John was working in unique circumstances and with unique polemical and evangelistic purposes in mind. For example, the Gospel of John was written after the destruction of the temple. The rabbis were consolidating power and tightening community definitions. Power was concentrating in the synagogues in the vacuum of the temple system's loss, and Jewish Christians were evidently coming into conflict within their synagogues. At the same time, John was facing a crisis in the other direction. Elements within the Johannine community were being drawn away by Hellenistic, Gnosticizing speculation and mythology. See 1st through 3rd John. And these forces, siphoning away the membership of the Asiatic churches, had already begun to be felt by Paul. See 1 Timothy and Ephesians. And by the time of John's writing in the late 1st century, these tendencies had given rise to a serious community crisis. Furthermore, being pushed away from the synagogue, the community was faced with isolation or evaporation if it could not thrive in the wider Hellenistic world. That is, if it could not successfully attract new converts in the centers of Asia Minor. This particular set of circumstances was largely unique to the fourth evangelist, and the influence of these circumstances can be detected in his gospel. If the writers of the synoptics did not use their gospels to address current issues, and can we be so sure that they did not, it should have little bearing on our conclusions about John. Furthermore, it may be helpful to mention that other Jews writing in John's time apparently were dealing with current events facing the Jewish community by recasting them in historical literature. For example, 4th Ezra, dating around 90 to 95 CE, and thus during the most popular dates for the Gospel of John, addressed the destruction of the temple in 70 CE through a historical discourse set in Israel's past. The ministry of the prophet Ezra became the vehicle for processing questions being asked by Jews in the late 1st century. The past was rebooted in order to deal with the present. Similarly, 2nd Baruch, also dating to the late 1st century, dealt with the temple destruction and the Jewish community's response to it through an apocalypse ascribed to the Old Testament figure Baruch. 2nd Baruch acts as a two-level history, pace Martin. Baruch's prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Zion doubles as a portrait of Jerusalem's fall in 70 CE. See 2nd Baruch 78 through 86. The Gospel of John likewise proves to be concerned with the Jewish response to the destruction of the temple. In John, quote, Jesus is represented as the new temple, a new center of worship, in and through whom Jews and Gentiles could worship God in spirit and truth. The Jewish apocalyptic books, Apocalypse of Abraham, 2nd Baruch, and 4th Ezra, written within a few decades of John's Gospel, represent some of the manifold ways in which the Jewish people were coping with the loss of Jerusalem and the temple. End quote. Like this proximate Jewish literature, the 4th Gospel also looks to summon the past in order to provide answers for current problems. Considering Jewish literature like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch allows us to establish in John's time at least a Jewish tendency to scour history for solutions to community challenges or disputes. In the case of the 4th Gospel, it is more recent history which provides the hunting ground, the ministry of Jesus, separated from John's writing by, probably, a span of around 60 to 70 years. Ultimately, there is no good reason why John could not have revisited the historical life of Jesus in order to resolve community conflict. This was, of course, the powerful thesis of J.L. Martin in his History and Theology in the 4th Gospel, 1968, and it is still widely accepted that Jesus' conflict with the Jewish leaders also represents a conflict between John's community and the Jewish leaders of the late 1st century. Even conservative scholars like R. Allen Culpeper have agreed with Martin that John transposed his community's expulsion from the synagogue onto the Jesus narrative. If John could have transposed this particular conflict, why not also the conflict with Gnosticism, which most scholars, via a consideration of 1 John, agreed that the community was embroiled in at the same time? The way remains ever clear for the consideration of the Gospel of John as a work composed to deal, in part, with the encroaching challenge of gnosis. 4. Later Gnostic infatuation with the Gospel of John. We will now confront the issue of Christian Gnostic use of John's Gospel, which in reality is closely related to our very first objection. It is probable that the unique method and patience of the Gospel of John, and the fact that its genre discouraged anachronism, and thus too direct of argumentation, inadvertently provided an avenue for the Gospel's exploitation. Several of the careful parallels which John had drawn to compete with Gnostic thinking were evidently misinterpreted, consciously or not, as open doors to the Gnostic worldview. Could we cite here a possible disconnect existing between some of the Gnostics and the traditionalist Palestinian Jewish background of John? It seems that some in John's environment were as quick to miss his Gospel's careful and unique argumentation as many in our own time. The epistle of 1 John, with its clarity and fiery condemnation, should probably be seen as a reaction against the Gospel's abuse, or at least as frustration at the unchecked swelling of Gnostic Christianity which John hoped his Gospel might stifle. And this is not to say that the Gospel of John was completely ineffective in its time. Representing one of the most complex and carefully crafted works of the New Testament, it likely served much of its highly educated audience well, especially on the Jewish side of its polemic. On the other hand, history bears witness to the fact that some of its most important lessons were missed, and continue to be missed, by its most influential readers on the Christian and Gnostic side. On the one hand, we might be tempted to say, as equitably as possible, that John is a brilliant work, a gospel of pearls just beyond the masses. On the other hand, we might consider it a thing once so tragically abused that it is now, due to dogmatic pressures and the hereditary failure of Christian theology, virtually impossible to conceive of any other meaning than what has been handed down. Indeed, Irenaeus had established the proper reading for Orthodox Christians and identified all other readings as heretical. This same basic reading has remained the popular standard since the heresiologists first divided orthodoxy from heresy and made those distinctions a matter of life and death. It is probable that some combination of the aforementioned factors composed the reason for the current popularity of the Orthodox reading of the Gospel of John, that is, the Christologically ambiguous, balanced reading of Smalley. In the end, despite the Gospel's brilliance, we can point to several factors which have allowed for its exploitation. Number one, the widening diversity of the Church, which progressively diffused Jewish influence and dampened awareness of John's Palestinian Jewish background. 2. The subtlety involved in the Gospel's misunderstanding motif, which ironically allowed for misunderstanding among less critical readers. And 3. The honed exegetical habits of the Gnostics and the Platonizing converts, which could elicit any meaning out of words. I will focus on this third and most important factor. Though the parallels had been intended to refute and compete with Gnosticism, the deliberate notional and terminological alignment between John and the Gnostic world was recognized by the Gnostics, particularly the Valentinians of the 2nd century CE, and thus, as Sanders reveals, quote, they tried to use the fourth gospel as a mine from which to extract proof texts. By doing this, they showed that they cannot have felt that it was anti-Gnostic propaganda. They tried by this means to vindicate their own systems as having apostolic authority. End quote. But again, the radically speculative exegesis of the Gnostics can account for their drawing unintended meaning from the gospel. For example, the Valentinians famously applied allegory to the Gospel of John's account of the life of the earthly Jesus, and so discovered a complicated symbolism which reflected real goings-on occurring in the heavenly realm. The Valentinian Heracleon's commentary on John, thought to be the first commentary on the Gospel, provides a prime example of this habit. J.N.D. Kelly explains that, quote, when St. John reports that the Lord went down to Capernaum, the Gnostic commentator Heracleon deduces from the verb went down that Capernaum must signify the lowest stratum of reality, i.e., the world of matter, and that the reason why Christ apparently neither accomplished nor said anything there must be that the material order was uncongenial to him. End quote. Realizing the flexibility of the Valentinian approach to the Gospel of John's meaning and intentions, it is not impossible to conclude that the Gospel's anti-Gnostic polemic was passed over, perhaps deliberately, in order to elicit an interpretation never intended by John. When one considers the problem which Gnostic Christianity posed for the proto-Orthodox Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and, of course, for the Johannine community, there is often a tendency to paint the non-Gnostic Christians as on the defense. But it may be helpful to consider equally the Gnostic struggle for legitimacy. This pressure may have led some Gnostics to push John's Gospel, consciously or unconsciously, towards saying what they needed it to say. Proto-Orthodox Christians, like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century and Lucius Lactantius in the 4th century, themselves had no problem discovering in the works of pagans their own proto-Orthodox doctrines of God. In their eyes, the data gleaned from the literature of the philosophers was even enough to count them as Christians before Christ. This sort of radical reinterpretation of texts from parallel religious traditions had already been in vogue by the time of the Fourth Gospel's emergence in the late 1st century. For example, Middle Platonists like Plutarch, from 45 to 120 CE, consciously brought Egyptian pagan texts in line with Plato, and Philo of Alexandria, 25 BCE to 50 CE, likewise discovered Platonism in the Septuagint. These readings were, of course, only possible if they ignored those elements which contravened with their native tradition and emphasized those with which they could discover some affinity. The Christian Gnostics, striving for legitimacy and apostolic authority, could have easily applied similar reading techniques in order to locate at least some implication of their own doctrines in John. Just as Christians today, at least on the Protestant side of things, often feel a pressure to locate their denominational theology in the Bible on the basis of sola scriptura, it is not unimaginable that Christian Gnostics felt similar pressures to discover and overemphasize any open door to their own doctrines on the basis of a quest for sectarian legitimacy. Indeed, for the sectarian, once the implication of precious dogma is able to be found and convincingly argued for, any textual evidence contravening with that dogma tends to recess first in importance, then in visibility. For example, Smalley's recognition of both a Docetism and an adoptionist-type subordinationism in John represents, at least from a Trinitarian perspective, a balanced account. Smalley understands that the gospel data, interpreted in a Trinitarian way, presents a paradox, a Jesus who is both God and not God. But the vast majority of Trinitarians will not admit both sides of this conclusion. Most Trinitarians choose to emphasize only that half of the contradiction which declares that Jesus is God. The data which evidences that John's Jesus is not God is either downplayed or wholly bypassed. In light of this phenomena, there are grounds for imagining how Christian Gnostics could similarly bypass the anti-Gnostic polemic in the fourth gospel, especially a polemic as careful as John's, through either genuine misunderstanding, which the gospel has for one of its chief themes and polemical mechanisms, or through deliberate appropriation. 5. A presumed lack of doctrinal clarity in the first century CE. Objections to the anti-Gnostic hypothesis are frequently made on the presumption of a lack of doctrinal clarity during the first century. The fact which scholars like Scott and Bultmann emphasized, that John, quote, seems on occasions to approximate to a Gnosticizing way of thought, while at other times appearing antagonistic to it, end quote, is often de-emphasized by Trinitarian scholars. This is, I believe, a mistake, and one quite possibly made under dogmatic pressures. For example, Smalley's reason for bypassing Scott and Bultmann is that he believes that in the time of the Johannine clash with Gnosis, it was difficult to discern what was heterognostic and what was orthodox Christology. Thus, Smalley finds it improbable that the Gospel of John was able or even intended to assist in this fight. But this may come near to assuming that John himself had trouble making distinctions between Gnostic views and his own doctrine of Jesus, which I suggest was not the case. In truth, it often is difficult to tell the difference between the Gnostic Christs and the Orthodox Chalcedonian Christ. But if John's Jesus is truly and only human, then his discrepancy with heterognostic Christs is immediate and clear, since all Gnostic Christs are in some sense a spiritual being, even God. Thus, all of the signs recognized by Scott and Bultmann, which point to an anti-Gnostic mission in John, need not be ignored. Again, we see that if one refrains from projecting later Chalcedonian orthodoxy onto John, then the nature of the fourth gospel and its real antagonism with Gnosis comes into view. 6. Alleged inefficiency of potential anti-Gnostic Johannine statements. Along the same lines as Smalley's objections about the Gospel of John being anti-Gnostic, Daniel R. Street has offered similar objections about the related epistle of 1 John, which may have some bearing on our inquiry into John's Gospel. Street especially targets the notion that John's epistle is anti-Gnostic or is reacting against either Docetic or separationist Christology. While there is not space to address all of Street's challenging arguments, we will take some time to confront several interesting points. The dominant opinion among scholars has been that 1 John is, in fact, a reaction to some sort of docetic, Gnostic-type Christology. Passages like 1 John 4, 2-3, quote, "Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess that Jesus is not from God," end quote, have made this clear for many scholars. However, a major concern of Street's is that the author of 1 John, if he really means to address a Christological heresy like Docetism, does not move to qualify or contextualize his own view of Christ's flesh. He points out that this and other passages, such as 1 John 1-3, have language which could easily be co-opted by Docetists. He also finds similar passages from John's Gospel, such as John 1:14 and 6:51-58, vulnerable to exploitation, and these passages evidently did suffer appropriation by ancient Gnostics. Street explains that, quote, "Many Docetists, in light of their statements concerning the flesh of Jesus, would find nothing in 1 John 4:2 necessarily impossible to confess, given their equivocations on the term flesh. The Docetist's ability to incorporate ideas of incarnation and fleshliness into his system would allow him virtual immunity to 1 John's attacks," end quote. Street is correct. Some Gnostic Christians, such as those in the schools of Valentinus, did contend that Jesus had a heavenly flesh, a real human nature, but one free from sin. Some thus held a developed dual nature view of the Savior. In light of this, Street ultimately finds the argument as it exists in 1 John, if intended to be anti-Gnostic, as ineffective. How could one distinguish between an orthodox view of Christ's flesh and a Gnostic view of Christ's flesh by John's simple affirmation of Christ's flesh? The problem with Street's concern is that it assumes that John's Christological outlook is Trinitarian. That is, it assumes John holds to a Chalcedonian-type view of Christ's humanity, which John's unqualified statements about flesh would not adequately preserve against Gnostic equivocation. But what if John's statement about flesh really did simultaneously describe his own doctrine of Jesus and refute the entire family of Gnostic claims about Christ? Street himself does take notice of a valid response to his charge of inefficacy, in an answer from Larry Hurtado, who writes that the accusation of 1 John 4:2, quote, "reflects the author's polemical judgment about the teaching of the secessionists, not a simple quotation of their teaching. The secessionists could well have referred to Jesus' flesh, but if so, their interpretation of it was unsatisfactory to the author, and he judged it to be, to all intents and purposes, a denial of Jesus' real fleshly existence," end quote. In other words, Hurtado's argument is that, quote, "the author is engaging in a fight to define flesh on his terms. He is denying that the Valentinians use the term properly," end quote. Ultimately, Street's largest problem with Hurtado's answer seems to be that he still expects John to attempt some nuance. But again, what if John's real view required no nuance? What if John's view was in fact, as he declares without qualification, that Jesus was human? In the end, I strongly agree with Hurtado that John refuses to meet the Gnostics on their terms. As the evangelist and authority on Jesus, the world must conform to his own language and meaning. Therefore, we must ask, did John believe that by affirming Christ's real flesh, that is, his real humanity, that he could simultaneously refute all of his opponents? This possibility would be strengthened if there happened to be one unifying feature between the proposed antagonistic Gnostic Christologies which John's statement could target and effectively crush in a single blow. Of course, as Harnack pointed out, the feature which unifies each of the Gnostic Christologies is the thesis that the Savior is, in some sense, a spiritual being. Thus, John's statements may have consequences not only for Gnostic Christianity, but also for modern orthodoxy. By declaring the unqualified humanity and denying the deity of Christ in one, Gnostic, sense, John denies it in every sense. Indeed, John calls those arguing for some form of Christ's deity liars, false prophets, and antichrist. It thus becomes more and more difficult to imagine that John was denying the deity of Christ in a Gnostic sense, but was affirming it in the Orthodox sense. It has already been admitted how difficult this distinction is. If John had really held to the simultaneously Docetic and adoptionist Christology perceived by Smalley, the balanced view of Chalcedon, we would agree with Street that an unqualified affirmation of Jesus' humanity is not effective as an anti-Gnostic polemic. The Trinitarian ultimately has difficulty discerning the efficacy of John's statement because his own view of the Johannine flesh is too close in principle to what John was collectively refuting. To conclude this section, we will take notice of one further observation of how the Gnostics utilized Johannine literature by Raymond E. Brown. Quote, "While 2nd century Gnostics used John, almost to the point of appropriating it, there is no clear evidence that they drew upon 1 John as a source for reflection. Indeed, as I shall point out, 1 John became a tool of the Orthodox Church writers in their arguments against the Gnostic interpretations of the Gospel of John. This would indicate that, whether or not he was combating proto-Gnostics, the thought of the author of 1 John was oriented in a direction that the Gnostics could not find amenable." End quote. If we assume that the Christology of the Gospel of John is the same as that of 1 John, then Brown's observation opens the possibility that there was only a difference in presentation between the two works, which allowed for the appropriation of one and not the other. Brown's observation may also lend weight to my earlier conclusion that the polemical statements and warnings in 1 John are a reaction to the abuse of the Gospel of John. In 1 John, there was no longer room for the patience exhibited in the Gospel's misunderstanding motif. The Gnostics were now at the door and moving to cross the threshold. They could no longer be allowed to exploit one side of the Gospel's thought, forcing John's epistles to once again make the Gospel's case for the human Jesus, but this time with even more force and clarity. 7. The satisfaction provided by Jewish evidence. In light of the Gospel's clear concern with Jewish arguments about Jesus, and its deep connection with Jewish thought, Craig Keener has cited the principle of Occam's razor against the hypothesis that the Gospel is also concerned with challenging Gnosticism. He concludes that, quote, "The Jewish evidence is sufficient to explain the fourth Gospel's context by itself." End quote. Of course, Occam's razor does not actually determine a solution, but only suggests what the best answer probably is by asking us to identify the simplest solution. But Occam's razor is by nature highly subjective. One investigator may easily differ from another on what the simpler solution is. Furthermore, the problem with a theory which emphasizes the simplest solution for the background and intentions of the fourth gospel is that, as Barrett explains, quote, "It cannot be maintained that the background of the gospel is simple." End quote. Indeed, in regard to the many questions which the gospel raises, quote, "The evidence is not sufficient to present a simple answer." End quote. If we aren't careful, employing Occam's razor here can easily become the fallacy of oversimplification, which occurs when it is assumed that there is a single, simple cause of an outcome, when in reality it may have been caused by a number of sufficient causes. In my view, Keener's approach misses the larger picture of the Johannine community's circumstances at the end of the 1st century, and wrongly downplays the significance of the Johannine parallels with Gnostic thought and with Hermetic literature. Most importantly, there are several features which cannot be explained or accounted for by Judaism alone, such as the Johannine teaching on rebirth and the Gospel's presentation of the relationship between God, teacher, and disciple. First, let us consider the broader picture of Johannine conflict at the time of John's writing. Keener's proposal seems to ignore the anti-Gnostic polemic in the proximate Johannine epistles. Many scholars have concluded that the Gospel of John and 1 John share the same authors, and most conclude that they at least originate from the same community and are dated to the same time period. Should we then be so quick to accept that the Gospel of John and 1 John do not share the same community concerns? Keener himself admits that, quote, "It is not at all impossible that tendencies towards Gnosticism were already creating problems for the Johannine community, see 1st through 3rd John," end quote. Thus, Keener does perceive that half of the Johannine literature is anti-Gnostic, and other scholars like J.A.T. Robinson, who saw, quote, "less evidence of a polemical motive in the Gospel," end quote, still found that there is, quote, "undoubtedly such a motive in the Johannine epistles," end quote. Since the majority of scholars conclude that 1 John is an anti-Gnostic polemic and reflects Gnostic Christian conflict in the Johannine community, the probability that the Gospel of John is concerned with a similar situation increases. If we grant, along with many scholars, that 1 John is written against a background of Gnostic conflict, and that the Gospel of John and 1 John are written around the same time and share either an author or a community, we are pressed to wonder if Keener's isolationist view of the context of the Gospel and of 1 John is really the simplest or best solution. It seems just as reasonable, given their parallels and historical proximity, to conclude that the Gospel of John is written to address concerns posed by a range of troublemakers for the Johannine community, which includes both Jews and Gnostics. Considering 1 John may provide further value. The Jews in the Gospel of John were arguing that Jesus of Nazareth was not the Messiah, and the Jews in John's environment were rejecting Jesus and those who looked to him. But in 1 John, John is clearly writing against an appropriation of Jesus. 1 John argues not simply against people who reject Jesus as Messiah completely, but against those who have mishandled him or replaced him with a counterfeit version. John calls this antichrist, that is, a replacement Christ. John stresses the human Jesus in light of this challenge and warns against any deviation from his specific doctrine of Christ. See 1 John 4. There indeed appears to be an important article missing from most English translations of 1 John 4:3, which might read, quote, "Every spirit that does not confess that Jesus is not of God," end quote. Here we are engaged with the question, what kind of Jesus do we have? Thus, 1 John's opponents are to be seen as promoting or making use of Jesus, but in a way that John did not approve of. Certainly, this cannot be accounted for by only an anti-Jewish polemic. If the Gospel of John and 1 John share dating, authorship, community, and Christology, then the Gospel of John begins to come into view as not simply and only promoting Jesus of Nazareth in the face of Jewish rejection, but to be promoting that Jesus of 1 John alongside the epistles in the face of Christological abuse by Gnosticizing Christians or appropriating pagans. As Scott concluded, quote, "The affinity between the Gospel and the epistle makes it probable at the outset that a similar purpose underlies both writings," end quote. Finally, it is important to note that not all of the evidence in the fourth Gospel can be accounted for by a purely anti-Jewish view of John. Though Keener argues that, quote, none of John's purportedly Gnostic or anti-Gnostic traits are limited to Gnosticism, end quote, we will find that this is simply not the case. These peculiar features, like the teaching on rebirth and the relationship between God, teacher, and disciple, we will discuss in later sections. But ultimately, in light of, number one, the historical context of the Gospel of John and the philosophical trends of the time, 2, the Gospel of John's probable origins in a cosmopolitan and Gnostic center like Ephesus, 3, its striking parallels with Gnostic thought and literature, which are not completely accounted for by Judaism, and 4, its proximity in date to anti-Gnostic polemics written by the same author or community, the multi-front conflict solution I am proposing begins to appear more helpful than the more isolationist reading. In our next entry, we will consider the nature of early Jewish Christianity in the first century, what the first Jesus community believed, and ultimately how it interacted with so-called Gnostic expressions of Christianity, specifically Christian Gnostic visions of God, Jesus, and humanity.